Hey, Hajichi. So, I guess I'm finally doing this. I'm Ryan, 28, and I'm gay. I threw up in I'm gay, asked me anything post yesterday, and some of y'all didn't hold back. The two questions that really hit me were, why did you decide to become gay, and how did you come to this? And how were you treated by others, and what happened with your family? Buckle up because this story isn't short, and it isn't always pretty. Let's rewind to my childhood. I grew up in Lakewood, a small town in Pennsylvania where everybody knew everybody. The kind of place where the high school football team's win was front page news and the local diner was the hottest spot on a Friday night. My parents, John and Linda, were solid middle-class folks. Dad worked as a mechanic at his own shop, John's Auto Repair, and Mom was a third-grade teacher at Lakewood Elementary. I had an older brother, Tyler, who was the town's golden boy, quarterback, prom king, and basically everything I wasn't. I guess the first time I thought maybe I was different was in middle school. While my friends were obsessing over which girl they'd asked to the school dance, I was more focused on how Josh Miller's hair curled over his forehead when he laughed. I didn't think too much of it back then. I just thought I was a late bloomer. High school was when the confusion really set in. I tried so hard to fit in. I dated Megan Collins during sophomore year, mostly because all my friends were getting girlfriends. She was sweet, freckles, a loud laugh, always smelled like strawberries. I liked holding her hand, but when she kissed me behind the bleachers, I felt nothing. Just this dull, hollow echo where I thought sparks should be. I buried it. I focused on school, tried out for the track team. I was terrible, joined the yearbook club, and kept my head down. But there was this constant buzzing in the back of my mind, a static I couldn't tune out. I started having these dreams, vivid and confusing, about guys in my class. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing with fear and shame. I spent hours online, scouring forums, reading stories from people who'd felt the same way. I found comfort in the anonymity, in knowing I wasn't alone, but it was also terrifying. I'd clear my browser history religiously, convinced that if my parents found out, they'd hate me. Senior year, I started dating Jessica Martinez. She was gorgeous. Long black hair, bright eyes, a smile that could melt ice. She deserved more than I could give her. I tried, though. I took her to prom, danced under the dim lights of the gym, and kissed her on her doorstep. But when she whispered that she loved me, my stomach twisted. I couldn't say it back. I thought if I just kept pushing, maybe I'd change. Maybe I'd wake up one day and feel what Tyler felt when he wrapped his arm around his girlfriend, Sarah. Maybe I'd stop staring too long at Ethan Peters during gym class, his back muscles flexing as he climbed the rope. When I graduated, I went to Penn State. It felt like an escape, a chance to reinvent myself. My dorm was a cramped shoebox with beige walls and a bunk bed I shared with my roommate, Kyle. He was a film major, all messy hair and thrift store clothes. He was the first openly gay person I'd ever met. Kyle wasn't a stereotype. He wasn't flamboyant or fashion-obsessed like the caricatures I'd seen on TV. He was just Kyle. He liked old horror movies, drank too much coffee, and had a hopeless crush on his history TA. We became friends. Real friends. One night, after too many shots at a dingy college bar, I blurted it out. I think I might be gay. The words hung in the air, heavy and strange. Kyle didn't make a big deal. He just nodded, handed me a glass of water, and sat with me on the dorm floor while I cried into my hands. I told him everything, the confusion, the shame, the constant fear that I'd disappoint my parents. He listened, didn't push, just let me unravel at my own pace. The first time I kissed a guy was a few months later. His name was Adam, a junior who worked at the campus bookstore. We met through Kyle, and he had this warm, easy smile that made my chest ache. It wasn't some grand, fireworks moment. It was soft, tentative, and real. For the first time, I felt something. But reality hit hard. Every time I walked across campus with Adam, my heart pounded, terrified someone would see. I wasn't ready. I broke it off, told him I couldn't handle it. He was kind, said he understood, but the hurt in his eyes haunted me. I started going to therapy. The campus counseling center was cramped, the walls lined with posters about stress management and healthy eating. My therapist, Karen, was gentle but firm. She didn't let me hide behind half-truths or vague answers. She helped me dig into the mess, pull out the tangled roots of my fear. Coming out to myself was the first step, but telling my parents? That was a mountain I didn't know how to climb. After that night with Kyle, things felt different. Not in a dramatic, fireworks in the sky kind of way, but more like a door had opened in a house I'd lived in my whole life. There was fresh air, and I could finally breathe. But as freeing as it was to admit it to myself, the real world felt heavier. I'd wake up in my dorm, staring at the water-stained ceiling tiles, and wonder how long I could live this double life. At college, I was starting to find my place. I joined the LGBTQ+ student group, not really saying much at first, just sitting in the back and listening. People that were so open, so unapologetically themselves. It was intoxicating. But every time I went home to Lakewood, I'd retreat into my old shell. I'd sit at the dinner table with Mom, Dad, and Tyler, nodding along to stories about his latest sales at the car dealership, the town gossip, or the church bake sale. The walls of our house were the same beige as they'd been my whole life. The faint smell of Dad's oil-stained work boots mingling with Mom's lavender candles. It was safe, familiar, and suffocating. The worst part was the pretending. I mentioned my friend, Adam, avoiding pronouns or keeping things vague. Mom would ask if I had a girlfriend yet, her eyes bright with that hopeful look only mothers have. Dad would grunt something about grandkids before shoveling another forkful of meatloaf into his mouth. I'd laugh it off, make a joke, and push peas around my plate until dinner was over. The weight of those secrets wore me down. Back at school, I started to unravel. I drank too much at parties, kissed guys whose names I never bothered to learn, and stumbled back to my dorm at 3 a.m. more empty than before. Kyle noticed. He'd sit with me, his silent presence on the other end of the couch, not pushing but not leaving either. Then came a night everything cracked open. It was spring break, and I decided to stay on campus instead of going home. I told my parents I had a big project, partly true, but mostly I just couldn't handle the thought of their questions. One night, I ended up at a party with Kyle and a few others. It was loud, bodies packed into a tiny apartment, the air thick with sweat and weed. I drank too much. At some point, I ended up on the balcony with James, a guy from my psych class. He had a slow smile and an easy laugh, and I felt that same pull I'd felt with Adam. We talked for hours, the cool night air sharp against my flushed skin. When he kissed me, it was soft and unhurried. I let myself lean into it, let the world shrink down to just us. And, of course, that was the moment my phone buzzed. It was Mom. I pulled away from James, my heart stuttering. I stepped inside, away from the crowd, and answered, "Ryan, are you okay?" Her voice was small, tight with worry. "Yeah, I'm fine. What's wrong?" We got a call from Mrs. Miller. She said Josh saw you on campus with another guy. Kissing. My mouth went dry. I couldn't breathe. My vision tunneled, the walls of the apartment pressing in. Josh Miller, of all people. He ended up at Penn State too, apparently. We weren't friends, but we'd nod in passing. Two small-town boys in a sea of strangers. I don't remember much of that conversation. There was shouting, my dad's voice in the background, harsh and sharp. Mom's tears. My own babbling, try to explain, to soften the blow, but it all came out wrong. I ended up on the floor of Kyle's bathroom, knees to my chest, my phone silent and cold in my hand. Kyle sat with me, rubbing small circles on my back, whispering that it would be okay, even if we both knew it wouldn't. The days after that were a blur. I didn't go home. I skipped classes. My phone filled with texts, Mom's desperate apologies, Dad's angry demands, Tyler's quiet confusion. I finally answered when Tyler called. He wasn't mad, just lost. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. And I didn't have a good answer. I thought he'd hate me, that he'd see me as something broken or wrong. But he just sighed, told me to come home, said we'd figure it out. It wasn't that simple, of course. When I did go home, the atmosphere was heavy. Mom hovered, making tea I didn't drink, offering cookies I couldn't stomach. Dad barely looked at me, his jaw tight, his hands stained with motor oil even on his days off. Dinner that night was silent. I pushed food around my plate, Mom's meatloaf tasting like ash in my mouth. Finally, I couldn't take it. I stood up, my chair scraping loud against the tile. I'm gay, I said. Just like that. 3 words, dropped like stones into a still pond. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad's fork clattered against his plate. Tyler just stared, his face unreadable. I waited for the shouting, the slamming doors, the accusations. Instead, Mom stood up and wrapped me in a hug, her thin arms tight around me. She cried into my shoulder, whispering that she loved me, that she was scared, but she loved me. Dad didn't say much. He stood, wiped his hands on his napkin, and left the room. His footsteps were heavy, the front door opening and closing with a soft click. I sat back down, my hands shaking. Tyler reached across the table, his calloused hand warm over mine. We'll figure it out, he said, one day at a time. The days after I came out to my parents were like walking through a fog. Everything was muted, muffled, like the world had a layer of cotton over it. Mom tried to keep things normal. She'd still pack my lunch for work, ask about my classes, and leave sticky notes with hearts on my bathroom mirror. But every time she looked at me, there was this sadness in her eyes, as if she was mourning something. Dad, on the other hand, shut down completely. He'd always been a man of few words, but now the silence was heavy. I'd find him in the garage, hunched over an old engine, his fingers black with grease. I tried to talk to him, but he'd just grunt or nod, his back a wall I couldn't climb. One afternoon, I worked up the courage to confront him. The garage was hot, the smell of oil thick in the air. He was leaning over the hood of an old truck, a wrench clutched in his hand. Dad, can we talk? He didn't look up, just kept twisting that damn wrench. About what? His voice was flat, mechanical. About me. About what I said at dinner. He sighed, wiped his hands on a dirty rag, and finally turned to me. His face was lined, older than I remembered, his blue eyes dull. I don't understand it, Ryan. I don't. You were supposed to. He trailed off, his shoulders sagging. I thought you'd have a family, kids. A normal life. I can still have that. Just not the way you imagined. His jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. It's not the way things are supposed to be. I felt a surge of anger, sharp and bright. Supposed to be? According to who? You? God? The guys at the shop. He threw the rag onto the workbench, the clang echoing off the concrete walls. You don't get it, Ryan. This town, this life, it's not easy. People talk. They judge. So you care more about what they think than about me? His face twisted, pain bleeding through the cracks. No. God damn it, no. But I don't know how to deal with this. I don't know how to be your father when I don't understand who you are. I stood there, my chest heaving, 1,000 words on the tip of my tongue. But none of them felt right. I turned and walked out, the afternoon sun blinding as I slammed the door behind me. For weeks, we barely spoke. I stayed on campus as much as I could, drowning myself in coursework and late-night shifts at the campus library. The old building was cool and quiet, the fluorescent lights humming as I restocked shelves and vacuumed threadbare carpets. It became my refuge, a place where I didn't have to pretend, where I could just exist. Kyle kept me sane. He'd drag me to movie nights or out for greasy diner fries at 2 a.m., his presence a lifeline. I started seeing Karen, my therapist, again. She helped me untangle the mess of guilt and anger knotted up inside me. She taught me how to set boundaries, how to take care of myself even when it felt selfish. One night, after a particularly rough session, I decided to write my parents a letter. I sat on my bed, the crumpled sheets twisted around me, and poured everything onto the page. I told them about the fear I'd felt growing up, the nights I'd spent praying to be different, the way their silence was crushing me. I wrote about Adam, about James, about how hard it was to be vulnerable when I was so afraid of losing them. I didn't hold back. I told them that I loved them, but I needed them to meet me halfway, that I couldn't keep bending over backward to make them comfortable at the cost of my own happiness. I mailed the letter and braced myself for the fallout. It took 2 weeks for them to respond. One Friday evening, as I sat on the dorm steps with Kyle, my phone buzzed. It was Mom. Ryan, can you come home this weekend? Her voice was soft, fragile. I hesitated. Is Dad okay with that? She sniffled. Yes. He wants to talk. The drive back to Lakewood was a blur. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as the familiar landscape rolled by. The town hadn't changed. The same worn-out billboards, the same crooked stop signs, the same kids riding bikes down Maple Street. When I walked into the house, Mom was waiting. She looked smaller, her shoulders hunched, but she pulled me into a hug that felt like home. Dad was in the living room, his hands wringing together as if he didn't know what to do with them. We sat down, me on the worn leather couch, my parents on the love seat. There was a moment of silence, the clock on the wall ticking too loud. Then Dad cleared his throat. "I read your letter." I nodded, my mouth dry. I don't know how to fix this, Ryan, but I want to try. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a start. We talked for hours. It was messy. There were tears, raised voices, moments where I thought one of us would walk out. But we stayed. We sat in that discomfort, the years of hurt and misunderstanding unraveling around us. When I left that night, my heart felt lighter. Not healed, not fixed, but lighter. Mom started calling me more often, little check-ins to ask about my classes or if I was eating enough. Dad didn't say much, but he'd send texts every now and then, pictures of the car he was restoring, a random "love you" kid that made my eyes sting. It wasn't perfect. Some days were still hard, but I was starting to see a path forward, a way to hold on to my family without losing myself. After that night at home, things began to change, slowly but undeniably. I started coming home more often, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. The weight of my secret was gone, and in its place was this tentative new version of my family. Mom threw herself into understanding. She called me with questions that were both sweet and a little awkward. Do you like that show, Queer Eye? I heard it's good. Or, I read this article about pride parades. Have you ever been to one? She started following LGBTQ+ accounts on Instagram, sending me posts with rainbow graphics and motivational quotes. It was a bit much, but I knew it came from a good place. Dad's progress was quieter. He'd invite me to help him in the garage, handing me a wrench without a word. We'd work in silence, the clang of metal and the hum of the old radio filling the space between us. One afternoon, as I held a flashlight for him under the hood of his Chevy, he spoke up. "I told Jim at the shop, about you." My hands tightened around the flashlight. "Yeah? What did he say?" Dad shifted, his voice gruff. "He said his nephew's gay. Guess he's married, lives in Seattle. Said he's a good kid." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, the warmth of the moment filling the cold garage. Back at school, life moved forward too. I started volunteering with the LGBTQ+ Center, leading discussions for freshmen who felt as lost as I once had. It felt good to give back, to offer a hand to kids standing where I'd stood. One afternoon, a freshman named Eli approached me after a meeting. He was all elbows and nerves, his curly hair falling into his eyes. "Hey, Ryan, can I talk to you for a sec?" "Sure, what's up?" He hesitated, chewing his lip. I haven't told anyone yet. About being gay. I'm scared my parents will freak out." I led him to the quiet corner of the center, the old couches sagging under our weight. I told him my story, leaving out the rougher edges but keeping it real. I told him about Adam, about my parents, about the nights I felt like I'd never belong. By the end, his eyes were wet, his shoulders less hunched. "Thanks. I don't feel so alone now." Those words stayed with me. They became this little light I carried, a reminder that my story, messy and painful as it was, could help someone else. I even started talking to James again. We drifted apart after the whole mess with my parents, but one night he texted me out of the blue. "Hey, you want to grab coffee?" We met at this little cafe off campus, the kind with creaky wooden floors and mismatched mugs. He looked the same, messy hair, that easy smile, but there was something softer about him now. "I heard you've been helping out at the center." "That's awesome, man." I shrugged, a bit bashful. "Yeah, it feels good." We talked for hours, the sun setting outside the window, painting the room in gold. We didn't pick up where we left off, not exactly, but we found a new rhythm. We'd meet up sometimes, going for walks around campus or catching a movie. It wasn't a romance, not yet, maybe not ever, but it was a friendship I hadn't realized I needed. And Kyle, God, I owe that guy everything. He stayed my rock, even when I didn't deserve it. One night, as we sat on his dorm floor eating takeout, I told him, "I don't think I'd be here if it wasn't for you." He looked at me, his chopsticks hovering over his lo mein. Dude, I just made sure you didn't drown in bad decisions. You did the hard stuff. Still, thanks. He grinned, shoving a dumpling into his mouth. Anytime, drama queen. Life wasn't perfect. There were still bad days, still moments when I felt that old weight pressing down on me. Sometimes I'd catch a look from an old high school friend or hear a whispered comment in the grocery store, and the fear would coil up in my gut. But now I knew how to handle it. I knew that I wasn't alone. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when Mom asked me to join her at church. I hadn't gone in ages. The memories of sitting in those stiff pews, hearing sermons about sin and salvation, had been too raw. But she promised me this was different. When I walked in, I saw rainbow flags hanging near the altar. The pastor, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, talked about love and acceptance, about how everyone deserved a seat at the table. I sat there, my hands clutched together, and felt this warmth wash over me. Mom reached over, her fingers lacing through mine. We didn't say anything, but in that quiet moment, I knew she was trying. And that was enough. Tyler, my brother, stayed steady through it all. He'd invite me over to his place, where his wife, Hannah, would make spaghetti and their toddler, Max, would babble nonsense at us. He treated me the same as he always had, never making a big deal about it, just being my brother. It felt like for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I needed to be. With every step forward, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt right. I wasn't just a gay kid from Lakewood anymore. I was Ryan, a psychology major, a volunteer, a brother, a son. I was building a life on my terms, no longer defining myself by the shadows of my past. One of the biggest milestones came the summer after graduation. I'd earned my degree in psychology. Ironic, maybe, considering how much therapy I needed myself. But helping others find their way through the dark felt like the perfect way to turn my own pain into something meaningful. Mom and Dad came to the ceremony. Seeing them in the crowd, their faces beaming, was a moment I never thought I'd have. Dad wore a pressed blue shirt, his hair combed back, and when I walked across the stage, he stood up and clapped, his pride unmistakable. Afterward, as we stood in the chaos of families hugging and cameras flashing, he pulled me into a hug. His grip was strong, his voice thick. "I'm proud of you, kid. So damn proud." Mom slipped a small box into my hand. Inside was a bracelet, simple silver with a tiny engraved tag. "Love is love." "I saw it at a shop and thought of you," she said, her eyes misty. "I know I'm still learning, but I hope you know how much I love you." I wore that bracelet every day. It became this quiet reminder that healing was possible, even for families as messy and imperfect as ours. Over the next few years, I dove into my work. I started as a counselor at a youth center, helping kids who felt lost, confused, or scared. Kids who needed someone to say, "It's okay to be you." One of my first clients was a girl named Emily. She was 14, with cropped hair and a guarded expression. She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands in her sleeves, staring at the floor. "I think I might be different," she whispered. I leaned forward, my voice gentle. "Different how?" Her eyes flicked up, a mix of fear and hope. "I think I like girls, but my mom says it's just a phase." I felt this wave of familiarity, the echo of my own teenage self. You know, when I was your age, I felt the same way. It's okay to not have all the answers right now. What matters is how you feel, and that those feelings are real and valid. Watching her face soften, seeing that tiny spark of relief, reminded me why I'd chosen this path. My relationship with James evolved too. We never became a couple, but our friendship deepened into something that felt like family. He became a regular at our family gatherings. Thanksgivings where Mom insisted on trying new vegan recipes, despite none of us being vegan. Lazy Sunday barbecues in Tyler's backyard, where Max would chase Bubbles across the grass. Kyle stayed a constant in my life. He ended up dating a girl named Sophia, a firecracker with a laugh that could fill a room. She fit right into our little circle, and I loved seeing my best friend so happy. And as for my parents, they became my biggest allies. Mom joined a PFLAG group, connecting with other parents of LGBTQ+ kids. Dad started talking more openly, sharing his journey with friends at work, breaking down those old walls of silence and shame. One afternoon, we stood in the crowd at our town's first Pride Parade. The air was electric, the streets lined with rainbow flags and people of all ages and backgrounds. Mom wore a shirt that said, "Free Mom Hugs," and spent the day embracing strangers who needed a bit of love. At one point, a young guy, barely 18, with a shy smile and a pride pin on his backpack, approached Dad. "Hey, are you Ryan's dad?" Dad nodded, looking a bit surprised. "Yeah, that's me. I just wanted to say, it's cool that you're here. My dad, he doesn't really get it, but seeing you, it gives me hope." Dad's face softened. He reached out, clapping the kid on the shoulder. "You hang in there, all right? You got a whole lot of people who've got your back." I stood a few feet away, my heart swelling. It was a full circle moment. The scared, lonely kid I used to be meeting the strong, supportive family I never thought I'd have. These days, life is good. Not perfect. No one's life is, but real and full in mine. I still have bad days. Sometimes the old doubts creep in, or I catch a bit of hate online that stings more than I'd like to admit. But I'm surrounded by love, by friends who are family and family who became friends. And sometimes, late at night, I'll log on to Reddit, scrolling through posts from kids asking the same questions I once did. Sometimes I'll reply, sharing my story, offering a hand in the dark. Because if my journey can help even one person feel a little less alone, then every rough patch, every tear, every sleepless night was worth it. Thanks for sticking with me through this. If you've made it this far, I hope you know you're not alone. Not now, not ever.